Thomas Blackwood stared at the stark white walls of St. Michael's Hospital's employee locker room, his perfectly tailored Armani suit feeling suddenly out of place among the scattered scrubs and worn sneakers. At 48, he'd never imagined he'd be trading in his executive office for night shifts in a hospital ward. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mock his discomfort. "Mr. Blackwood?" A stern voice cut through his thoughts. "I'm Sarah Chen, your supervisor for the night shift." He turned to face a compact woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her expression was professional but skeptical as she took in his expensive attire. "The board might have approved this arrangement," she said, emphasizing the last word. "But on my floor, your last name means nothing. My patients come first. Always." Thomas nodded, swallowing his instinctive urge to remind her who owned the hospital. After all, that was precisely why he was here. The Blackwood Healthcare Group had been in his family for 3 generations, and now that he was set to take over as CEO, the board had dropped their bombshell requirement, 6 months working in one of their hospitals, starting from the ground up. "I understand," he replied, reaching for the folded scrubs in his locker. They felt rough against his manicured hands. "I'm here to learn." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Good, because tonight's going to be challenging. We're short-staffed, and the oncology ward is full." She checked her watch. "Get changed. Orientation starts in 5 minutes." As Thomas changed into the plain blue scrubs, he caught his reflection in the small locker mirror. Gone was the commanding presence he'd cultivated in boardrooms across the country. Instead, he saw a middle-aged man looking decidedly uncertain, his silver-streaked hair and angular features at odds with the utilitarian uniform. The night shift stretched before him like an unknown country. He'd reviewed the hospital's financial statements countless times, analyzed efficiency metrics, and approved budget cuts from the comfort of his office. But he'd never spent a full night in one of his family's hospitals. He'd never seen what happened in those quiet hours when the administrators and executives were home in their beds. Sarah was waiting when he emerged from the locker room. "First stop is Morning Glory Wing," she said, already walking briskly down the corridor. "That's where our long-term patients stay. Most are terminal cases." Thomas hurried to keep up, his new shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. The sound echoed through the quieting hospital as day shift workers headed home, and the night shift settled in. With each step, the reality of his situation became clearer. This wasn't just some formality he could breeze through. This was real work, with real patients whose lives didn't care about his family name or his MBA from Harvard. They reached the wing, and Sarah paused outside the heavy doors. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice low but intense. "These patients aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They're people facing the hardest battles of their lives. Some won't make it to see another summer. Others are hanging on just to meet their first grandchild or see their daughter graduate. They need more than medical care. They need compassion, dignity, and someone who sees them as human beings." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. How many times had he approved budget cuts that affected this very ward? How many staffing reductions had he signed off on, all in the name of efficiency and profit margins? Before he could dwell on these thoughts, Sarah pushed open the doors. The wing was quieter than he expected, the lights dimmed for the evening. A few nurses moved between rooms with practiced efficiency, checking monitors and administering medications. The air carried a mix of antiseptic and something else, perhaps the lingering scent of dinner, or maybe just the indefinable smell of people living out their days in an institution. "Room 412, Sarah said, leading him to the first door. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, 73 years old, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She's been with us for 3 months. She paused, fixing Thomas with a steady gaze. "She also used to be a nurse here for 30 years. Helped build this wing's reputation for exceptional care." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered signing the paperwork for a major staffing restructure 5 years ago, which had led to early retirement for dozens of veteran nurses. Had Mrs. Martinez been one of them? She's usually awake at this hour, Sarah continued, likes to watch the sunset through her window. Tonight, you'll help me with her evening care routine. She handed Thomas a patient file. Read this thoroughly. Then we'll go in together and you'll learn what healthcare really means. Mr. Blackwood. As Thomas opened the file, his hands trembled slightly. The pages before him weren't just data points anymore. They told the story of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others and was now facing her own mortality in the very halls she once walked as a caregiver. The night was just beginning, and Thomas Blackwood, heir to a healthcare empire, was about to learn his first real lesson about the true cost and value of medical care. What he didn't know was that this night would mark the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about business, healthcare, and his own purpose in life. Sarah watched him reading the file, her expression unreadable. "Ready?" she asked after a few minutes. Thomas closed the file, took a deep breath, and nodded. He wasn't ready, not really, but he understood that wasn't the point. Nobody was ever ready to face the raw reality of human suffering and mortality. You just had to step forward and do it anyway. As Sarah reached for the door handle, the distant sound of a code blue alarm echoed through the corridors. She froze, then turned to Thomas with an intensity that made him step back. "Looks like Mrs. Martinez will have to wait. Lesson 1, Mr. Blackwood. In healthcare, plans change in an instant, and every second counts. Follow me, and whatever you do, don't get in the way." Thomas ran behind Sarah, their footsteps echoing through the dimming corridors of St. Michael's Hospital. The code blue alarm continued its urgent wail, leading them to the East Wing. His heart pounded, not from the exertion, but from the growing realization that he was about to witness something far removed from quarterly reports and board meetings. They burst into room 327, where a team of nurses and a resident doctor were already gathering around a bed. The patient was a young man, maybe in his early 30s, his skin ashen against the white hospital sheets. The monitor above his bed screamed its warning as his heart rate plummeted. "What do we have?" Sarah demanded, immediately taking charge. "Jake Morrison, 32, post-op day 3 from tumor resection," a young nurse reported rapidly. "BP dropping, heart rate irregular." "He's crashing," the resident shouted. "Starting compressions." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the medical team moved with practiced precision. This was nothing like the sanitized hospital dramas on television. It was messy, desperate, and terrifyingly real. The sound of ribs cracking under compressions made him wince. "Blackwood!" Sarah's sharp voice cut through his paralysis. "Make yourself useful. Get me that crash cart and stay close." He moved without thinking, pushing the cart closer to the bed. Sarah began preparing medications with swift efficiency, calling out orders that sounded like a foreign language to his ears. For the next 20 minutes, he watched the team fight death with everything they had. Finally, mercifully, the monitor's frantic beeping steadied. Jake's heart had started beating on its own again. The room collectively exhaled. But Thomas noticed that Sarah's expression remained grim. As the team began to disperse, Sarah pulled Thomas aside. "Stay here," she ordered. "Jake's wife is in the waiting room. She needs to be informed, and you need to see this part too." Minutes later, a young woman rushed in, her face pale with fear. She wore rumpled clothing and clutched a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. Thomas recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same desperate hope he'd seen in shareholders during financial crises, but this was infinitely more personal. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said gently, guiding her to a chair, "your husband experienced a cardiac event, but we were able to stabilize him. But he was doing better," Jake's wife whispered, her voice cracking. "The doctor said the surgery went well. We were supposed to start planning our future again." Sarah sat with her, explaining in calm, compassionate terms what had happened and what it meant. Thomas watched, remembering all the times he'd approved policies that limited post-operative care staff to cut costs. How many Jake Morrisons had faced complications because of reduced monitoring? Later, in the quiet of the medication room, Sarah finally addressed him. "You're thinking about numbers now, aren't you? About staffing ratios and budget cuts?" Thomas nodded, unable to deny it. "If we'd had more nurses on this floor, maybe we would have caught the warning signs earlier," Sarah finished. "But that's not even the worst part. Do you know what Jake does for a living?" Thomas shook his head. "Look, he's a high school teacher. The insurance your hospitals accept, it barely covers half of his treatment. His wife works 2 jobs, and they're still drowning in medical debt." Sarah's eyes bore into him. "That's the reality of healthcare in America, Mr. Blackwood. That's what your board meetings and profit margins look like on the ground." Before Thomas could respond, their attention was drawn to a commotion in the hallway. An elderly man was shuffling towards the nurse's station, his hospital gown fluttering around his thin legs. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah sighed, but there was affection in her voice. "Another midnight walk?" The old man smiled vacantly. "Need to catch my train. Margaret's waiting for me in Cincinnati." Thomas watched as Sarah gently took the man's arm. "Margaret's not in Cincinnati, remember? She passed away last year, but I bet she'd want you to get some rest." The pain that flashed across Mr. Peterson's face was brief but profound. "Oh, yes. Yes, of course. Yes. Margaret's gone." His voice trembled. "Sometimes I forget. Sometimes I just want to forget that I forgot." As Sarah led Mr. Peterson back to his room, Thomas followed, carrying the man's IV pole. He listened as Sarah chatted with him, skillfully distracting him from his confusion and grief. It was a small moment, but it struck Thomas deeply. This was healthcare too, not just saving lives in dramatic code blue situations, but preserving dignity in quiet midnight hours. When they finally returned to the nurse's station, Thomas found himself staring at the computer screen showing patient records. The interface was familiar. His company had spent millions developing it, but now he noticed how many clicks it took to access basic information. How many unnecessary complications the staff had to navigate. "Your system crashes at least twice per shift," Sarah commented, noticing his attention. "Each time we lose precious minutes that could be spent with patients, but I'm sure it looked great in the PowerPoint presentation." The criticism stung, but Thomas couldn't deny its truth. He'd approved that system based on its cost-saving potential, never considering the real-world impact on patient care. A young nurse interrupted their conversation, looking worried. "Sarah, Mrs. Martinez is asking for pain medication again. It's too soon, according to the chart. But she's really suffering." Thomas felt his chest tighten. They still hadn't made it to room 412, where his first patient of the night was waiting. The former nurse turned patient, whose care would have been directly impacted by his past decisions. Sarah checked her watch, then the medication charts. "This is where policy meets reality, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Want to see how your pain management guidelines actually work in practice?" As they walked toward Mrs. Martinez's room, Thomas realized that every step in this hospital was teaching him something new. Each patient, each crisis, each quiet interaction was slowly dismantling the walls between the healthcare he thought he understood and the reality of what it truly meant to care for human beings in their most vulnerable moments. What he didn't know was that the night's most profound lesson was still waiting for him in room 412, where Eleanor Martinez was about to show him exactly what his family's legacy had become and what it could be instead. Room 412 was dimly lit when Thomas and Sarah entered, the soft beeping of monitors providing a steady rhythm in the darkness. Eleanor Martinez lay propped up against white pillows, her thin frame barely making an impression on the hospital bed. Despite her obvious pain, her eyes were sharp and alert as they fixed on Thomas. "So," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, "you must be the Blackwood heir I've been hearing about." There was something in her tone that made Thomas's skin prickle with unease. Sarah moved efficiently around the bed, checking vital signs and preparing medication. Mrs. Martinez needs her pain medication adjusted, she explained to Thomas. Current policy says we have to wait another hour, but I'm dying anyway, Eleanor interrupted with startling frankness. And corporate policy about opiate restrictions doesn't account for terminal cancer patients who spent 30 years building this hospital's reputation. She turned her penetrating gaze back to Thomas. Tell me, young man, have you ever watched someone die in pain because of a policy you wrote? Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. 2 years ago, he had indeed spearheaded a strict pain management policy across all Blackwood hospitals aimed at reducing opiate prescriptions. It had looked excellent on paper, a responsible corporate response to the opioid crisis. He started, but Eleanor wasn't finished. I was here when your grandfather ran this hospital, she continued, her voice growing stronger despite her pain. Richard Blackwood knew every employee by name. He understood that healthcare isn't just about bottom lines and efficiency metrics. He used to say that a hospital is only as good as its nurses' ability to provide comfort with dignity. Sarah quietly prepared the pain medication, bending the rules just enough to provide relief while maintaining safety. Thomas watched her skilled movements, remembering how many times he'd criticized nurses for excessive time spent on individual patient care in efficiency reports. Your grandfather built something special here, Eleanor said, her voice softening as the medication began to take effect. We were a family. Every patient mattered. Every staff member felt valued. But then your father took over and suddenly everything was about profit margins and market expansion. Thomas sat in the chair beside her bed, compelled by her words. Were you here during the transition? He asked, dreading the answer. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Oh yes, I was here. I watched it all change. I was the head nurse of this ward when your father's optimization initiative forced half my staff into early retirement. The ones who stayed had to handle double the patient load. She paused, closing her eyes briefly against a wave of pain. Do you know what happened next? Thomas shook his head, though he had a sinking feeling he knew where this was going. Medical errors increased. Patient satisfaction plummeted, but the profits soared. Eleanor's eyes opened again, fixing him with an accusatory stare. And you've continued that legacy, haven't you? Making healthcare more efficient, more profitable, less human. Sarah stood quietly by the bed, her presence a silent witness to this confrontation. Thomas could feel her watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to these hard truths. 3 months ago, Eleanor continued, when I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I could have gone to any hospital. I chose to come here because I wanted to see for myself what had become of Richard Blackwood's legacy. And you know what I've found? The nurses here, angels like Sarah, they still try their best to provide that human touch. But they're overwhelmed, understaffed and bound by policies that prioritize profits over people. She reached out suddenly, grabbing Thomas's hand with surprising strength. Your grandfather used to say that every hospital room holds a human story, not just a medical case. When was the last time you heard one of those stories? Mr. Blackwood, the question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and challenge. Thomas found himself looking around the room, really seeing it for the first time. The family photos on the bedside table, the hand-knitted blanket draped across Eleanor's legs, the get-well cards taped to the wall. Each item represented a connection, a life touched, a story intertwined with the cold machinery of modern healthcare. I remember your grandfather sitting with a dying patient for hours, Eleanor continued, her voice growing weaker as the pain medication took full effect. He missed a board meeting because an old veteran had no family and was afraid to die alone. That's the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. Thomas felt tears pricking at his eyes, remembering his grandfather. He had been too young when Richard Blackwood died to understand the true nature of his legacy. All he had known was the business-focused approach his father had implemented, the emphasis on growth and efficiency that had shaped his own understanding of healthcare management. Mrs. Martinez, he began, his voice thick with emotion, But Eleanor's eyes were closing, the pain medication finally bringing her some relief. Sarah gently adjusted her pillows and checked her vital signs one last time. "Come on," she said quietly to Thomas. "Let her rest. We have other patients to check on." As they left room 412, Thomas paused in the doorway, looking back at Eleanor's sleeping form. In the dim light, he could almost imagine her as she must have been in her prime, a dedicated nurse fighting to preserve humanity in an increasingly corporatized healthcare system. "Your grandfather's office is still there, you know," Sarah said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. "It's used for storage now, but everything's exactly as he left it. Sometimes when things get really tough, some of the older nurses go there just to remember what this place used to stand for." Thomas turned to her, an idea forming in his mind. "Show me," he said. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me. But remember, what you're about to see isn't just about the past. It's about the choice you have to make about the future." As they walked through the quiet corridors toward his grandfather's old office, Thomas felt the weight of 3 generations of Blackwoods pressing down on his shoulders. But for the first time since starting this night shift, he was beginning to understand that weight wasn't just about financial responsibility. It was about the sacred trust between those who provide care and those who need it most. What he would find in that office would shake him to his core, forcing him to confront not just his family's legacy, but his own role in either preserving or destroying it. The door to Richard Blackwood's office creaked open, releasing the musty scent of forgotten memories. Sarah found the light switch, and a soft glow filled the room, revealing walls lined with medical texts and framed photographs. Dust motes danced in the air as Thomas stepped inside, his shoes leaving prints on the floor that hadn't been walked on in years. "Everything's exactly as he left it," Sarah said softly, staying by the door as if giving Thomas space to absorb his grandfather's sanctuary. The administration wanted to renovate this space years ago, but the nursing staff practically revolted. This room, it means something to them. Thomas moved slowly around the office, his fingers trailing over the heavy wooden desk. Unlike the sleek minimalist furniture in his own office, this desk showed signs of real use: coffee rings, pen marks, even what looked like tear stains. It was a desk where real decisions about real lives had been made. The photographs on the walls told stories of their own. His grandfather stood with various hospital staff members, not in formal poses, but in candid moments, laughing with nurses, comforting patients, celebrating births, and mourning losses. In every image, Richard Blackwood's eyes held the same warm intensity that Thomas remembered from his childhood. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a framed document on the wall. It was the original hospital mission statement, handwritten by Richard Blackwood himself. To heal with compassion, to serve with dignity, and to remember that every patient is someone's loved one. Thomas's throat tightened as he read the words. How far they had strayed from that simple, profound mission. His own mission statements were full of corporate jargon about market leadership and stakeholder value. As he settled into his grandfather's chair, the leather creaking beneath him, Thomas noticed a leather-bound journal in the desk's center drawer. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. "That's his personal journal," Sarah explained. "He wrote in it every day, documenting not just hospital business, but the stories of patients and staff. The triumphs, the losses, the lessons learned." Thomas opened the journal, his grandfather's familiar handwriting filling the pages. One entry caught his eye. "Today, we lost young Michael Peterson after a 3-year battle with leukemia. His parents couldn't afford the full course of treatment, but we found a way. Some board members questioned the financial wisdom of treating patients who can't pay, but I reminded them that our purpose isn't to make money. It's to save lives and ease suffering. The day we forget, that is the day we should close our doors." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. How many patients had been turned away from Blackwood hospitals in recent years due to inability to pay? How many lives had been reduced to red ink on a balance sheet? He continued reading, finding entry after entry that showed a different way of running a hospital. His grandfather had created programs to help patients with medical debt, established support groups for families of terminal patients, and insisted on maintaining high staff-to-patient ratios even when it cut into profits. "There's more," Sarah said, reaching for a dusty box on a high shelf. Inside were hundreds of letters, thank you notes from patients and their families spanning decades. Thomas picked one up at random. "Dear Mr. Blackwood, when my husband was dying, you didn't just provide medical care, you gave us dignity in our darkest hours. The nurses had time to hold his hand, to listen to his stories, to help him feel human until the end. How do you thank someone for that kind of gift?" Another letter read, "You found a way to help us afford our daughter's treatment when no other hospital would. She's graduating college next month, something we never thought we'd see. You didn't just save her life, you saved our family's future." Thomas read letter after letter, each one a testament to what healthcare could be, should be. Tears fell freely now, dotting the papers in his hands. A commotion in the hallway broke the moment. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Code blue in room 327. Repeat, code blue in room 327. "It's Jake," Sarah said urgently. "We need to go." Thomas carefully placed the journal and letters back in their places, but he was a different man standing up from that desk than the one who had sat down. As they hurried toward Jake's room, his mind was racing with possibilities, ways to honor his grandfather's legacy while adapting to modern healthcare challenges. They arrived at Jake's room to find the same scene as before, medical staff fighting to save a young life. But this time, Thomas didn't stand frozen in the doorway. He jumped in to help, following Sarah's instructions, becoming part of the team fighting for Jake's life. When they finally stabilized Jake again, Thomas pulled Sarah aside. "His teacher's salary won't cover another week in ICU, will it?" Sarah shook her head. "The insurance is maxed out. His wife's been talking about taking out a second mortgage." Thomas straightened his scrubs, a new determination in his eyes. "Not anymore. I want you to tell them their medical debt is cleared. All of it. And I want a complete review of every patient in this hospital who's struggling with payments." Sarah studied him carefully. "That's a nice gesture, but it's not just a gesture," Thomas interrupted. "I've been reading quarterly reports for so long, I forgot what my grandfather never did, that behind every number is a human being. A family, a story." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "We need systemic change, not just one-time solutions, and I think I know where to start." He pulled out his phone, checking the time, 3:47 a.m. "I need to make some calls. Emergency board meeting first thing in the morning, but first," he looked down the hallway toward room 412. "I need to talk to Mrs. Martinez again. She needs to know that her words didn't fall on deaf ears." What Thomas didn't realize was that his night shift was about to take one more unexpected turn, one that would cement his transformation and set in motion changes that would ripple through the entire Blackwood healthcare system. His grandfather's legacy wasn't just in the past, it was about to find new life in the most unexpected ways. Dawn was breaking over St. Michael's Hospital as Thomas made his way back to room 412. The first hints of sunrise painted the corridors in soft golden light, but his mind was still processing the darkness of the night shift that had changed everything. Sarah walked beside him, her shift nearly over, but her dedication unwavering. They found Eleanor Martinez awake, sitting up in bed and watching the sunrise through her window. She turned as they entered, her eyes immediately noting the change in Thomas's demeanor. "You look different," she observed. Her voice stronger than before, "like you've seen something that shook you to your core." Thomas pulled up a chair beside her bed, his scrubs wrinkled and his expression earnest. "I found my grandfather's office," he said simply. "I read his journal, saw the letters, understood finally what this hospital used to be, what it should be again." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Richard's journal, he wrote in that thing every day. Said it helped him remember why we do this work." "Mrs. Martinez?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "I need your help. You knew this hospital when it was at its best. You saw what real healthcare looks like. I want to bring that back. But I can't do it alone. She studied him carefully. And how do you propose to do that? Your board won't like any changes that cut into their profits. Let me worry about the board, Thomas said with newfound confidence. I'm calling an emergency meeting this morning. But first, I need you to tell me everything. Every program my grandfather ran, every policy that put patients first, every initiative that made this hospital a family rather than a corporation. For the next hour, Eleanor shared stories and insights, her voice growing stronger with each memory. She described patient assistance programs, staff support systems, and community outreach initiatives that had made St. Michael's a beacon of hope. Sarah contributed too, pointing out current problems and suggesting solutions based on her frontline experience. As they talked, Thomas took notes on his phone, his mind already formulating plans. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A message from the board secretary confirming the emergency meeting for 9 a.m. I have to go get ready, he said, standing. But Mrs. Martinez, I promise you, this isn't just talk. What I've learned tonight, what you've shown me, it changes everything. Eleanor reached for his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. Your grandfather would be proud, she said softly. Not because you're following his path exactly, but because you're finding your own way to carry his legacy forward. 2 hours later, Thomas stood before the Blackwood Healthcare Board of Directors. Gone were his designer suit and power tie. He remained in his scrubs, still bearing the marks of his night shift. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady and determined. Last night I learned more about healthcare than I have in 20 years of reading reports and analyzing data. I met our patients, not as numbers, but as people. I watched our nurses work miracles despite policies that hinder rather than help. I saw both the best and worst of what we've become. He laid out his plan, a complete restructuring of patient payment policies, increased staffing levels, revival of community health programs, and a new employee support system. The board members shifted uncomfortably as he detailed the costs. This will cut into our profits significantly, one director protested. The shareholders invested in a healthcare company, Thomas interrupted firmly, not a profit machine that happens to provide healthcare. My grandfather understood that if we take care of our patients and our staff, the business will take care of itself. The debate was heated, but Thomas stood his ground. He shared stories from his night shift, Jake Morrison's struggle, Mr. Peterson's dignity in dementia, and the legacy of Eleanor Martinez. He showed them his grandfather's journal, read from the letters, and painted a picture of what their hospitals could be again. By noon, he had his victory, a narrow board approval for his initial changes, with a 6-month trial period to prove their value. Thomas returned to St. Michael's that evening as his first night shift staff began arriving. He had announcements to make and changes to implement, but first he had a promise to keep. In room 412, he found Eleanor sitting with Sarah, both women looking at old photographs. It's done, he told them. The board approved everything. We're bringing back the patient assistance programs, increasing staff levels, and that's just the beginning. Sarah's eyes widened. Everything? Even the community health initiatives? Thomas nodded. Everything, and I want both of you involved in the implementation. Mrs. Martinez, we need your experience and insight. Sarah, you'll head up our new staff advocacy committee. We're going to do this right. Eleanor smiled, tears in her eyes. You know, she said thoughtfully, when I chose to spend my final days here, I thought I was coming to witness the end of something beautiful. Instead, I'm seeing a new beginning. Thomas pulled up a chair, settling in for what would become a regular part of his new routine, spending time with patients, learning their stories, understanding their needs. He had 6 months to prove that compassionate healthcare could coexist with sound business practices, but he already knew what his grandfather had known all along, that true success in healthcare isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched and dignity preserved. As the evening shift began around them, Thomas shared his plans in detail with Eleanor and Sarah. The hospital was humming with its usual activity, but something felt different. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes the most profound changes begin in the quiet hours of a night shift, when someone finally stops to listen to the stories that really matter. 6 months later, St. Michael's Hospital had been transformed. Staff turnover dropped dramatically, patient satisfaction scores soared, and while profits were indeed lower, they were sustainable. More importantly, the hospital had regained its soul. Eleanor Martinez lived to see many of these changes implemented, her room becoming an unofficial meeting place for staff and administrators alike. When she finally passed away, it was with dignity, surrounded by the family she had helped rebuild. Thomas kept his grandfather's journal, adding his own entries alongside the old ones, but he also started a new tradition. Every new hire at a Blackwood hospital, from janitors to surgeons, spent at least one night shift working directly with patients. Because, as Thomas had learned, some lessons can only be taught in those quiet hours when healthcare is stripped to its essence, one human being caring for another. And in the end, that was exactly what healthcare was meant to be. What would you do if you had the power to change an entire system? Have you ever witnessed a moment that completely transformed your perspective on life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could inspire others who are facing similar crossroads in their lives. Has someone's dedication to their work ever touched your heart? Tell us about a nurse, doctor, or caregiver who made a difference in your life. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the deepest impressions. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what really matters in life, give it a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who believe in the power of human connection and transformation. Join us on this journey of discovering stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Looking for another powerful story that will touch your heart? Click the video on your left. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. It's a journey of redemption and discovery that will leave you just as moved and inspired as this one did. Remember, every subscription, every like, every comment keeps this channel alive, allowing us to continue bringing you these emotional, life-changing stories every single day. Your support means everything to us, because in the end, we're not just sharing stories, we're connecting hearts, changing perspectives, and reminding each other what it truly means to be human. See you in our next story. Until then, keep believing in the power of transformation. Sometimes it happens when we least expect it.